So you had also been going back and forth between Jamaica and the States, and you've lived in a bunch of different places, which I mentioned because your portfolio also indicates that you invest all over the place. And you, for a fund investing at your stage with the headcount you have, it is less typical to see that geographically dispersed a portfolio. And I'm wondering if you think that because you moved around a lot in the first 20, 30 years of life, that led you to conclude that it made a lot of sense to be geographically prolific and diverse.
Yeah. So a couple of my mentors are here, Mitch and Frida. And one of the things that they said to me early, these aren't the exact words, but it was something like, talent is ubiquitous, but access to capital is not. And so that stuck with me. And I felt like as a venture professional, we have a duty to go and find that talent wherever it is. And so while, at Mac, 90% of our investments are in the US, North America, 10% are offshore, primarily Nigeria and Kenya. But in the US, outside of the 50% that's in California, which is where we reside, we're all over the place. We're in Bentonville, Arkansas. We're in Atlanta. We're in New York, because that's where the talent is.
And you mentioned Mitch and Frida, and we are honored to have them both here. And I have a question because they played a pivotal role in introducing you to another really important business person and friend in your life. And I'd like you to tell that story. I should also I'll just mention the book that Harper put out last year that the two of you co-authored, and we will drop the title in the chat and send a link to folks following this when we send a recording of it. And the work that the two of you have done, both as impact investors, as agents of social change, as financiers of innovation, has been amazing. And you are two of the people that Betsy and I really look up to for the way that you have presented yourselves in life and the way that you've allocated your time and your capital. So really appreciate it. It's great to have you here. And I know you came for him, not me, but it doesn't matter. So do you want to talk a little bit about them kind of compelling you to meet a friend of theirs on 2 days' notice?
Yeah. And this venture story of mine would be a lot different had they not been a part of it. When I went to business school at Cornell, and I led Cornell's venture fund while I was there, and then graduated and joined Intel Capital. And that allowed me to move to the Bay Area, which is when I met those two characters. And for some reason, they liked me. And so we kind of hit it off. And, over the years, they'd just been giving me advice, and we were sharing deals and things like that. And so at year 5 at Intel Capital, I decided it was time for me to go out on my own and create something that I thought could create greater impact, greater wealth for me, and just be all around better. And put together this PowerPoint presentation. It was terrible. Who do we call the fund at the time? I think it was like Dunn's River Capital, after a famous waterfall in Jamaica. It was terrible. But went in and gave them the pitch, not to become investors, but just give us advice, right? Like, what do we've never started a fund before. I have no idea what we're doing. Just help us out. And not only did they give us feedback on the pitch, and we incorporated all of it, but they also said, you know what, we're going to be your first investors. And they committed a anchor investor size check to the firm. And at that point, we had nothing before that. But they said, we got one condition. You got to go to LA and you got to go meet this guy, Troy Carter. He's a friend of ours. I think you'll get along well. And so we said, okay. It turned out I was going down to LA because I was living in the Bay Area at the time to meet with Magic Johnson to pitch him on the fund. I think in like 2 days. And for those of you who don't know who Troy is, a very accomplished entrepreneur, talent manager, and investor. So he's credited with building the careers of like Lady Gaga, John Legend, Meghan Trainor, etc. He's also, at the angel investment stage of like Uber, Spotify, Lyft, Warby Parker, etc. So very busy person, and I'm headed there in 2 days. But they figured out how to get me on his calendar. So I go and I meet with Magic Johnson. A terrible meeting. He wanted to take the entire fund and name it and do no work. And I was just like, can't do that, man.
Wait. Sorry. He wanted to take the entire fund.
So not actually invest.
Why is that a bad? Okay.
Right. Like wanted it to be rebranded, something Magic, I don't remember. Wanted to have, all of the decision making in the company, but wasn't actually going to do any day-to-day work on it.
Isn't he famous for passing the ball to his teammates a lot? Isn't that part of it? Okay.
He was passing it to his buddy Ryan, who was gonna work with me, full time while they take all the equity and I do all the work. But so it wasn't gonna work out. So left that meeting, went over to Atom Factor, which is what Troy's company was called at the time, to meet with him. And I'm like, oh God, it's gonna be another one in LA. This is gonna be another one of those meetings. And we sat and we talked for like 2-3 hours. And really hit it off. And at the end of it, he was just like, you know what? I'm not going to invest in your fund because I invest off of our balance sheet and I'm doing well with that. But, we should stay in touch. Nice to meet you. He was like, all right, well, for me, I'm thinking I checked the box. I did exactly what they asked me to do. And he said no. So, all right, let's keep it moving. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Troy's assistant. Please hold for Troy. And I'm like, okay, you're calling me, but all right. And he gets on the phone and he's like, look, man, can't get this out of my mind. I've always wanted to create a fund. At least he thought he did. Always wanted to create a fund, but haven't found someone that I felt comfortable doing it with. I think that could be you. Let's figure it out. So thinking back to the whole Magic Johnson thing, I'm like, I don't know, LA thing, he's going to ask for the whole fund. But he's like, no, let's split it right down the middle. I'm in this thing with you. And, we went off and we built our first fund. It was called Cross Culture. It was a $15 million fund. We have a number of companies that are still operating. We had some exit already and returned some money to our LPs. And then ultimately, Troy's who he is. He's a mogul, right? He's got to be in a lot of different things. And as we thought about how do we actually build a multi-generational franchise, you need your partners to be 100% in and focused on this thing all the time. And so we had that constructive and difficult conversation. And at the end of it, he said, I'm going to focus on a few other things. Why don't you take the brand and continue to build it? And that's a whole nother story.
All right. And you talked about returning money to LPs. Afsani, something about returning money to LPs. You did this deal in Egypt and it won all sorts of PE in Africa awards. And because you get paid to manage risk, like deciding to move 30 blocks uptown, you were managing risk and thinking about how to attain liquidity. Do you want, so we started with a pretty significant date on the calendar. You want to talk about how you intertwined with another important date on the calendar?
Yes, thanks for reminding me of that. It's very stressful. Thank you for reminding me of that. That was a one of the more stressful weeks of my life. So just the context was the very first deal we did was a generic pharma medicated cosmetics business in Egypt that actually ended up becoming the country's largest low acuity generic medicated cosmetics business in the country. And we invested in it. It was two founders. I mean, it wasn't VC. I mean, they had cash flows and EBITDA sort of, but it was two founders who were pharmacists who started mixing potions in their basement kind of 20 years ago. And the reason it was not the kitchen was the wives had kicked them out of the kitchen. So they had to kind of mix potions in the basement of one of the guys' houses. And they ended up finding a factory to sort of outsource manufacture. And they ended up really creating the cosmeceutical sector in Egypt. And we, invested in the business. We had thought that this would be a great local IPO story because it was a great local brand. We knew the Egyptian pound, over time devalues, and that is one of the risks we face in a lot of our markets. But this business was really competitive against, the Pfizers, the Baxters of the world, because it actually had a local manufacturing base. And so we actually almost tripled the net income of the company. We appointed, the company's first CFO, their first head of HR. And so we thought, okay, it's time, we're ready to go public. And so the first attempt at going public was April 2021. So I'm sure nobody in this room remembers, if you remember something about April 2021, it was probably not that a tanker got stuck in the Suez Canal, but that did happen in April 2021. So our first attempt at going public, it was all going great. It was actually my first in my 21-year career IPO. Egypt was on fire. The currency had actually strengthened in our hold, and we had a fully covered IPO. And the night before the IPO, the head of the financial authorities in Egypt asked us to pull the IPO because there was a tanker stuck in Suez Canal. Egypt generates a huge amount of its forex from the Suez Canal, and they felt that while we were exiting entirely, aftermarket trading would be a complete nightmare. And in these markets, we suggest you pull your IPO, but it was very clear it was not in any way a suggestion.
And did you have a risk factor in the prospectus that our IPO may be adversely impacted by a boat that's too big for a canal?
We unfortunately did not have that. And but the business was performing very well. And so we put pause, the tanker sort of a week later unlodged itself. It took a week holiday. It was all good. And then we came back, and around about November, the company was going to have a very strong 2021. We relaunched the IPO. We hired the best investment bank in the region. We overpaid them. And we IPO'd on February 10th, 2022. So I'm sure many people do remember what happened on February 24th, 2022. That was the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And so we actually had a significant liquidity event. It was just over $100 million. And it was interesting. We had there was rumors in the market that troops were amassing on the Russian-Ukraine border. Nobody thought at all that there would be an outright invasion. And we started to see the Egyptian pound start to falter. And we had a decision that, do we wait till the currency stabilizes, a week, a month or two, et cetera, or do we just try and repatriate the cash right away? And what happens in many of these markets is, the Egyptian economy has a managed peg. And so it props up the currency in a way based on Forex reserves. And we took the decision that we are going to get our money out of the country as quickly as possible. And we actually repatriated just over $100 million the day before the Ukraine war. And actually, 2 weeks later, the Egyptian pound devalued 20%. The stock market fell 30%. And unfortunately, had we held that position, we would have been at 30 cents of book value. But actually, we were able to create nearly a 2.5 times return for our investors, having made that very quick decision, which ultimately ended up being totally lucky. I did not know that there would actually be an invasion, but we just took the decision that we didn't want to wait.
Yeah, and I thank you for sharing that story, and I'm sorry for dragging you back into stressful situations. One of the things that we as lawyers are supposed to be doing is making sure that our clients understand and are managing risk around the decisions that are dependent on what happens if everything goes to shit. And part of the telling of these stories is just like everything does go to shit in a bunch of different ways, multiple times a year. So for most of you who had business dealings and investments, a ship getting stuck in the canal was not a black swan event, but for you it was a big deal. And so we are trying to think through how to manage for those kinds of things and how to preempt them, and when to exit, and even just selling all at once when you have a liquid position, because so much of what we do in venture is think about illiquid positions and not dollar cost averaging, and not doing, making volume decisions is also kind of wild. Part of investing in Africa, or different countries in Africa, also is about managing currency risk, and we see that in Nigeria for sure. Marlon, how do you think about that in your non-US portfolio?
Mm-hmm. We try to focus on companies that can actually bill in USD, right? So then it doesn't so much affect them. That's really the only thing you can do. Because like what happened in Nigeria is just crazy. They devalue. There's no rhyme or reason for how deeply they made the cuts.
Betsy and I have an investment in a terrific, I won't mention the name of the company because I'm going to give some numbers, but in a terrific African growth company we invested when it was a startup, and revenue is tremendously ahead.
In Naira. Yeah.
Different story in dollars. So it is fascinating to see how those things work in those markets. Can you talk a little bit? I want to go back. You mentioned Cornell, and that you led the venture fund at Cornell Johnson. A friend did tell me that you, I think this is true, you're the second best VC in America to have a Cornell MBA. Is that correct?
Yeah. Who told you that, Aaron?
Well, how many other people do you think are ahead of you on that list? Yeah, it was Aaron. Aaron Holiday from 645 Ventures.
Yeah.
Okay, in fairness, he didn't say that. That may have been my misinterpretation intentionally.
Aaron's terrific. I was actually the first Black person to lead the school's venture firm, and it went well, actually. Number of things that we did. When I took over, we had maybe 15 associates in the program. But you had a whole business school that was interested in venture that wanted to participate. You could only have 7 or 8 fund managers, right? And then you had these 15 folks that would help work on deals. So it's like, well, why not like multiply this? And so we ended up with about 60 associates. And what I did with that was I started going around to different venture firms around the country, and I said, we've got world-class research institution and 60 of the most talented MBAs that are willing to work with you on due diligence projects for free. And so many of them took us up on that. And so it helped to kind of raise the status of the fund. It helped get a lot more people involved in the fund that were interested in venture, so they could start to build experience as they thought about recruiting into the space. And for me personally, I got to make relationships with a bunch of VCs that I could then call for advice and talk to about potentially getting jobs, et cetera. The part of how I landed at Intel Capital. But Aaron was the second person of color to lead the fund. He became a good friend of mine. We overlapped by 1 year. And I just worked hard as hell to make sure that he was the guy that took over, because he's one of the people I know.
Yeah, and he did say lovely things, which I won't bother repeating, about you, and that it was great that it was a back-to-back thing. And so you brought a lot more. You not only brought a lot more people into the fund, but that meant that there were a lot more people at Cornell getting credentialed in venture before they got out of school, which changes their opportunity set, their access, their experience. That is also something you did in starting a nonprofit with some friends years ago that got people ready for college in a different way, and where you set about to change their mindset on that. And I was struck in listening to you talk about that in a very old interview, that while you were starting out in your career and had not yet made enough to have the 6 kids and Alice on salary, that you decided to spend a lot of time with your friends giving back and creating a curriculum and tutoring kids. Can you talk a little bit about that program? Because there are other iterations of that have gone through you've always been doing that sort of stuff. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, man, you digging in the crates here. Like this, this is pre business school. But yeah, a couple of close friends of mine. I was going through this program called Management Leadership for Tomorrow, and it's a program that prepares you to get accepted into the top business schools, and then like do well while you're there. And I was thinking back to high school and the fact that I was the first and I had no idea what I was doing, and like this program would be amazing for someone in high school like me. And so I was like, let's just create it. And so I called up a couple of my friends and we did it. We raised a bunch of money and we recruited some of the top students in New York City, lower income schools that we felt were very talented, but were on the closer to the poverty side of the financial situation, and because of that, we're thinking their choices for college were limited. Like they were all thinking, oh, we can go to City College or something like that. So ultimately, we raised this money. We partnered with a SAT test prep organization. It's called Bell Curves. They taught them how to take the test. We taught them how to apply for schools and how to select the school that's best for you. And then we sent some of these kids to Cornell, Wharton, Vassar, a bunch of schools, many of them on scholarships. And we ran that program. It was, we all had day jobs. We kind of did it on the weekends and in the evenings until we got to a point where we could actually hire someone to run it. And I think it was like maybe 10 years running before we shut it down. And we shut it down because one of my co-founders, Dale, he became a big kind of real estate hedge fund guy and got super busy. And then I moved to California, so couldn't have the same touch points. So it ultimately died, but I think we did some good along the way.
And when you think about the work that you do in your board role at Kaufman, do you feel like that's a continuation and part of a thread of like, I'm going to get as many people involved in the venture fund at Cornell as possible, and I'm going to do this thing where I ready these kids for a different college experience than they were planning on? Is it?
Yeah. So I was fortunate to go through the Kaufman Fellows program. Without it, I think I would eventually, started my own fund, and maybe we get here today, but slower. But it was very, it was a life-changing experience for me. And I wanted to make sure that, but also I was, one of 2 people of color in my class. At that point, the classes were like maybe 30 people max. Now the classes are about 60. And I looked just kind of like at the alumni, and there weren't many of us that, look like many of us in this room. And I wanted to change that. And so when they asked me to join the board, this was almost 4 years ago now, I said yes, if we make a pact to increase our diversity numbers, both underrepresented folks and women. And since then, I worked really closely with the team to make sure the applications were read in a fairer and a more equitable manner, and that we had scholarship money in place because it's pretty expensive still, to allow first-time fund managers of color to actually be able to pay for the program. And we've had remarkable numbers, like well above industry standards over the last 3 years. And we want to, it's an application process right now. So each year we've grown, and I want to see it continue.
I had heard that you were credited with being a major precipitant of that shift. That shift was noticeable from where I sit, and is amazing. And I applaud the impact that you had there. And also, since you mentioned looking like this room, I do appreciate and value that this room looks different than a lot of other spaces in venture. And I just want to thank all of you for showing up and making this room look that way. It is greatly appreciated and valued. So thank you to all of you. So Afsani, I want to talk about health tech in Africa, and you have spoken very passionately about the structural issues. And there's a discussion that you had at, I think, a Bloomberg private equity conference, where you talked about the fact that in Cote d'Ivoire, there are 14 oncologists for the whole country, and you were concerned that 7 of them may head to Europe in the coming year. And can you talk a little bit about how you think through your investment thesis on, I'm going to invest in health tech at a place where we don't have the human resources to actually provide the healthcare?
No, thank you. So this is probably my favorite topic to talk about, so I will modulate.
It's really uplifting, by the way.
Pardon me?
I said it's a really uplifting topic.
It's so I really feel like I have the world's best job. Like, I would do my job for free. I have the coolest job, and basically, I'll tell you what I do, and I'm very, very thankful for the work I'm able to do. So, our fund invests across the life cycle in healthcare, health tech in Africa. So, just a bit of a context of the African market. I think Africa, which is 54 different countries, thank you for pointing that out earlier, is a whole blend of different economies, but gets a very bad rep. When most people think of Africa, they think of famine, they think of poverty, they think of Ebola, they think of Boko Haram. Like, those aren't there, and there's pockets of that in Africa. But Africa is also, 1 billion plus people, and some economies are very highly educated. Ethiopia, is the breadbasket of the world. There are more families with $10,000 of income in Africa than there are in India. And the wonderful thing for healthcare and health tech is there's very little to disrupt, because those markets are very nascent, right? So in a way, a little bit like the US, African countries don't have a healthcare system funded by the state for a whole host of reasons, right? Increasingly, universal healthcare or health equity is coming, but those economies have been really structurally challenged and fiscally challenged, particularly post the Ukraine war. Energy prices have gone up. In food inflation, a lot of food, unfortunately, even though Africa does produce a lot of unprocessed food, a lot of processed food is imported. So if you take, for example, we invested in the largest online pharmacy and telemedicine business in East Africa. And that business has grown several 100% in the last few years. And it's a really incredible case study, right? So if you look at a country like Kenya, sort of 40-ish, the East African region, you could argue is about 100 million people. The average GDP per capita is around 100. And if you look at the challenges to health equity in Africa, they're really on 3 points of a triangle. There's financial capital, like who pays for care; human capital, like who actually treats the sick people; and physical capital, like are there hospital beds, are there pharmacies, are there labs? And each country is on like a slightly different trajectory. But really, there's not much in most of those countries. But that also presents a huge opportunity, right? When you invest in healthcare in developed markets, or in most industries in developed markets, the only way you make money is undercutting your competitors or disrupting them and taking market share. The wonderful thing about the African healthcare market is there's been very little investment in that market really until the last 5 to 10 years, and there's really no one to disrupt, right? So the example of Ivory Coast is one, but the Kenyan example is maybe a bit more tangible because we've invested there. So it turns out that people do actually really want to spend on medication and primary care for their families. And you know, African families are just like all of our families. Like, what most people here would probably spend their last dollar on secure medication and healthcare for their family and their children. Like, I would say 99%, you know, and basic food and water. And so we invested in this model where the challenge of growing access to pharmacies in Africa, you know, on that kind of trajectory is, okay, Africans pay more for drugs than any other continent in the world except North America, but they have the lowest GDP per capita, and it's because they don't have bargaining power. There's not enough big pharmacy chains and big groups and big governments to negotiate with the big pharma. They have, you know, Nigeria, and I don't know the number per se in Kenya, but it's similar, has 1/1000th the number of pharmacists the World Health Organization recommends, and they just don't have enough pharmacies. They don't have enough primary care centers. They don't have that, but yet there's a huge demand. So we invested in this company called My Dawa. So My Dawa means my drugs in Swahili. It also means my drugs in Arabic. And the model was simple. We were going to be an online pharmacy where we can deliver anywhere in Nairobi within an hour. And frankly, I live in London. I think it would be wonderful if someone could deliver my medication within an hour in London. And we were going to undercut the high street by 20%. And how are we going to do that? So we actually created our own brand, and our brand is this bright pink and green, kitschy, loud brand on billboards. It actually is the second most prominent brand in Nairobi other than Amazon. And we are going to undercut the high street by 20% by importing generics from India, branding them with a local brand. And then actually we got a $3 million grant from the Gates Foundation to build out our telemedicine capability. So now we have that kind of, we've kind of solved the triangle, right? So we're making the drugs cheaper because we don't have to pay, you know, as you know, and many of you know, African economies are really volatile, but oftentimes in the prime high street or the prime malls, you have to prepay your rent for like 5 years in dollars. Right, that really pushes up the prices. There's not enough pharmacists, there's not enough doctors. So we've solved the human capital thing. We're not paying expensive rents. We don't need a generator. We don't need security guards. We're importing the medication from India. We're leveraging the very limited human capital we have. Like, a pharmacist sitting in a call center can see 400 people in a day and prescribe 400 people in a day. We also have Kenyan doctors in a call center. They can see 600 people in a day. You tend to find in African countries, the human capital in healthcare is focused in the big urban centers. So you end up finding that a lot of the urban, semi-urban and rural population literally have no access to primary care, but those people are also potential patients. And then the physical capital, you actually don't need to go into a store. We've made it virtual. So it's been an incredible success story, both from an impact perspective, but also from a financial perspective. You know, we have actually been approached by the largest distributor of medication in Africa to acquire our business because they just have really been struggling to reach the last mile. And through marrying the telemedicine and the online pharmacy, we're actually providing holistic primary care, but we're also able to reach, for really the first time, the rural and the semi-urban populations, which are huge amounts of people, and we're doing it at a unit economic price that works for them, but also works for us and is quite scalable. So that's just one example of being able to provide. I mean, it's not hugely disruptive. It's not AI. It's, you know, part of it could be AI, but it's just taking a model that reduces the cost, increases the quality, and increases the reach. That's like an existing technology, but we haven't had to disrupt a Boots or a Walgreens or a Duane Reade because those, you know, those multinationals aren't there. They don't see those markets as unit economics. So they've largely been ignored because they're approaching it in a very traditional way.
So whether you're investing in crypto or robotics or AI, understanding the dynamics of that specific market, understanding how the geographies that you're touching have different characteristics of demand, and who the payers are is huge. And the fact that you don't have this installed base to disrupt, because that business wouldn't be supportable in the UK. And if you tried, there'd be a lot of incumbents who would lobby and get it clobbered.
Absolutely.
Right. So that changes the risk calculation, but having that expertise is critical. Marlon, can you talk a little bit about the expertise that you're deploying and what Mac is particularly looking at these days?
Well, so we're a generalist fund. So we invest in a lot of things. Like we have a company that's re-engineering the tampon, to a company that's trying to put a fully sustainable and reusable rocket in space and bring it back down. And there's a lot of things between that. I think our bread and butter though is probably B2B software, across fintech, digital health, primarily. We have a couple Africa-based health companies I should probably introduce you to. So we'll talk about it after this. But yeah, that's we try to look for really large challenges that aren't adequately being addressed, and we try to find really stellar founders that are poised to bring novel solutions to those challenges. That's how I would define what we're looking for in our companies, and it'll span a lot of different industries and sectors. It will all be primarily seed stage though. So, and for us, that means they've built a product and they've started testing it with the market, or they've released it onto the market. Because the thing that we do better than most, we feel, is helping our companies with go-to-market strategy. So that's a sweet spot for us, right?
And for go-to-market strategy, there's another interview that you gave several years ago where you talked about your post-investment onboarding meeting. You said sometimes it could be an hour, sometimes it's 3 hours, sometimes it's half a day or a full day. Mm-hmm. Is that something that you're still regularly doing? How often is it really long when you're doing that? What happens when you do that post-investment onboarding meeting?
Well, what happens is the rest of the team gets to learn, has a more in-depth view of the company and their immediate challenges and goals, so that now all 9 of us can work to help this company get to the next stage, right? And now that also I think the biggest thing is, now that the game is done, the investment game is done, right? Where everyone's holding some cards back during that process, right? And now you've gotten the funding, right? So we're partners now. There's no reason to hold anything back. So that thing that you didn't want to tell us about, let's talk about that. Understand how we're going to get past that. Now that it's rare that we'll get into like a half day or full day meeting anymore with these. Their standard is about an hour. And yeah, we dive in deep with the founders.
So you're investing at 2 very different times in the cycle. You're taking control positions, or you might be partnering with someone where collectively you're taking control positions, which is private equity. You're doing work with a business that might have been family owned before you've come in. I'd like to dig in a little bit on the difference between what you're looking for in leadership at the company and what you're looking for, because you're investing more on potential, and you've seen the arc of what happens when potential is met by great execution. Mm-hmm. And you've also seen the other side of that. Mm-hmm. So Afsani, what are you looking for in management that's different? And part of the relevance of this is there are a lot of people in the audience who are founders or who are leadership of the startup or growth company that they're currently at. So what do they have to demonstrate to you as an exit partner?
Great question. It's a great question, and I think our thinking and our learning has evolved in that as we've grown and also made mistakes and figured out how things work. Well, I would say it's probably 3 or 4 main things. So our strategy is we generally invest in market-leading businesses that we feel can grow regionally, either through acquisition or buy and build. And we generally take a controlling stake in those businesses. And the reason we look for market-leading businesses, and it doesn't, we tend to invest in niche businesses. So we own, for example, the largest group of cancer hospitals in Morocco. It's not the largest group of hospitals, but it's market-leading in its niche. And a part of it has to do with risk. Risk in emerging and frontier markets is very different than risk in developed markets, and I've worked in both. I think my heart valves are a bit weaker having, spent this much time in emerging markets, but you're dealing with business risk, you're dealing with human capital risk, but you're also dealing with currency and geopolitical risk. So market-leading businesses tend to sustain those risks better. They tend to have better leverage with their suppliers, with their financing providers, with the government regulators when things go badly. And, having control is nice when things are going well, but it's almost absolutely necessary when things are going badly. So I think we look for founders who have managed through good times and bad, and who still have a passion for what they do. And luckily we're investing in healthcare and health related sectors. So generally the types of people, and we almost always back founder CEOs or the sons or daughters of the founder. So they have that kind of psyche within their family. They have a passion for what they do. They have a strong sense of ownership. We generally, our most comfortable place in the capital structure is between, 51 to 70%. We'd like to see the founders still have real skin in the game. So someone who's managed through good times and bad still has fire in their belly, passion for what they do. We are founders of something called Investors for Health alongside the UK Government Development Bank and the IFC. And I sit on the board of EPIC, which is Ethical Principles in Healthcare Investing. That's a really important part of our ethos. We really want to partner with people who want to bring high quality, affordable healthcare to our markets. We don't invest in businesses or with management teams who really cater to the A class, who, we're not investing in plastic surgery hospitals or high-end cataract hospitals. Like, we're investing in businesses where the management team really want to cater to the mass market. I think something else I've learned from one of my really brilliant colleagues who's Nigerian, he's the former CEO of GSK Nigeria. I sometimes wonder why he works with us, but he's wonderful and he still works with us. Once a week across our portfolio, we do something called a pre-mortem. So instead of a post-mortem, and you've something's gone bad and you try and figure it out, he's really been in there scrapping it out in one of the most difficult markets in the world. And so every week we do this pre-mortem, and then once a month we do it with the management teams.
And the pre-mortem
is
shit's about to go down. Let's talk about it.
All the shit that's going to go down,
Okay.
List it, and how are you resilient within the business in case any of these things happen? For example, we had not foreseen the Suez Canal thing. But, what if the currency devalues 300% next week? What are you going to do? How much can you pass through pricing? How much inventory can you stockpile? In a lot of these markets, it's not so much the devaluation, but the dollar liquidity, right? A lot of the raw materials for healthcare are imported from abroad. Mm-hmm. So when the currency devalues, everything's 200% more expensive, but you actually just can't find dollars to buy medication for your hospitals. How do you manage that? What if there's a regulatory change? There's a new minister of health. He's like the cousin of the king. He doesn't want to do something. And, we've had situations where we built Morocco's first private bone marrow transplant unit and then couldn't get it regulated. And what do we do? Right? People on our waiting list were literally dying. What do we do? How do we creatively think about, can we partner with someone? Can we get an operating license from someone else? So a lot of it is people who are good at that preemptive panicking and just figuring out how to build the resilience into the business, but also not being paralyzed because, there are so many growth opportunities. So you could be totally paralyzed with this preemptive panic and not do anything and miss out on a lot of growth, or you could just operate up here and not see some of the encroaching risks to your business that are particularly acute in emerging markets. So those are probably the 3 or 4 things we look for.
So there are a couple of things I particularly want to dig in on. Faye, I may want to hit you up on a question about preemptive panicking, if that's okay. So I'll give you the question, and then I'll give you a minute because I'll just tell people why I'm hitting you up for this. So one of the most respected public health people and advocates in the world is right here, and it's Faye Wattleton, who was the CEO of Planned Parenthood for years and years, and influenced in positive ways an institution that I used to really like called the U.S. Supreme Court, and has been on the boards of Columbia and many amazing places. And in your role at Planned Parenthood, especially during the many years that you were there stewarding it, I'd love to hear how you handled preemptive panicking and how that's different now that you're the co-founder of a quantum computing company and handling preemptive panicking in that capacity. So I'll give you a minute to think about that. But I love the concept of preemptive panicking, and having grown up as a Jewish kid from Brooklyn in the 70s, I feel like that is an area of expertise for me. I'm trying to understand how you distinguish between those who freeze at the stick versus those who get through it with great aplomb. But Faye, can you talk a little bit about how you dealt with that? Like, because you just had crisis after crisis during your leadership period.
Well, I don't know that anybody can hear me. So.
Yeah. I'll come stand with you. We'll be on camera.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to the panelists, because so much of what you've said rings true to a lot of the challenges that I encountered as the leader of Planned Parenthood, because at that time we were the largest domestic-based family planning assistance program in the world, and we supplied birth control in 68 countries to women's organizations. And so I don't have to tell you that the challenges of just simply what are we going to do if we can't get the condoms off of or through customs, and what happens if there is a major reduction in the currency, that these are all the kinds of issues that are universal. I think that one of the things that's really important for this group to digest is that all of the issues that you've been talking about, they're really about business. It doesn't matter whether the purpose is nonprofit or for the social good. What really is the core of your business, and what do you want to achieve, and what risk are you willing to take? During my time as Planned Parenthood, the risk that we had to take was the risk of violence, that our clinics were being bombed and burned. And so how do we provide services to our clients when they really have to encounter dangers in order to access those services? And what decisions do your staff, and I haven't heard a whole lot about what your people go through, but what decisions do you impose on your staff that could, in fact, endanger their personal safety and their security? So those are I always worry about the black swan, because there's shit happens, excuse me for saying that, but it just does. And I think that the great danger is that we get caught up in the love of what we're doing and we forget about, but what ifs? And regardless of the enterprise, we're going to find that the what ifs will always dog you, and they should be, and they should. And if they're not dogging you, then you're really not doing a service to the investors. And in the case of the nonprofit sector, doing a service to the people that you uphold to serve. So there's so much commonality in what you guys have talked about, including working in Africa. Africa is you gave a nod to the fact that it is more than just a single place. It is a continent of very different cultures and very different histories. And I think we should really remember that, and not crush us all together in a basket. I am the co-founder of a quantum hardware developer. So that seems like a long way from what I did before, but it really isn't. It really is about building the next generation of access to knowledge that hopefully, if we marshal it and if we get out ahead of where we are right now with AI, that a lot of what you purport to aim for in business will be given enormously powerful tools to access information and knowledge, so that we will ideally, and I say this ideally because there is a lot of money to be made in quantum. And for those of you that may not be familiar with quantum, it is not an extension of AI. It is a new generation of information processing that has the ability to go through your cryptography and to really open a whole new world of capacity and power. So the question will be, how do we use that? How do we begin now to say, wait a minute, who's going to have the benefit of that? I think about your discussion about accessing the pharmacy markets in countries where it still is largely a mom and pop deal in those countries. How do we begin to think about, this is new technology, how do I understand, and what are the guardrails that we're going to put on this, so that it's just not going to be one or two or three big companies that benefit, but rather the world will be made better by it. And so that's what keeps me up a lot. And I wasn't planning on giving a speech, but here we are. Quantum is really upon us, by the way. And for those of you that are looking at me blankly, I hope that this will stimulate you to go to your computers, to go to your machine and educate yourself about a technology that really has the ability to revolutionize the world as we know it.
Thank you for catastrophizing with us, Faye. We appreciate that. So do you, Marlon, when you're in board meetings, do you see your companies and do you see other board members do the kind of catastrophizing exercise that we've just had Faye and Afsani talk about?
No, it's all roses and peaches. No, not to that extent. I mean, the board meetings are really to talk about what's happening right now with the company and what is likely to happen over the next quarter or so. So it's really focused on that. But it's an interesting thing, right? To think about what can go catastrophically wrong, and making sure that we're thinking about doing that. I think early stage ventures are a bit more optimistic in our day to day. So
I'm glad you mentioned optimism, because you also said somewhere that you not only are looking for optimists when you're hiring for your firm, but as part of the hiring process, you used to, or maybe still do, conduct some sort of exercise for like glass half full and making sure that the people that you're hiring are in fact optimists, because that's how you have to think about taking big swings. I get that. Did I get that somewhat right?
yeah, I mean, I think to do this job well, and I'm still learning how to do it well, you have to be curious, first of all, right? You need to want to learn about new things all the time. That's got to drive you. And then two, you've got to believe that the impossible is possible. Otherwise, we don't have these cell phones in our hands walking around, right? We don't have quantum computing coming. We don't have AI, right? Like at some point in time, these things were thoughts, and thoughts become things. And if you don't believe that thoughts can become things, then you don't actually belong in this business.
And I think we're looking at one of the differences between venture capital, which is like, it's going to be freaking fantastic, and private equity, which is like, I really can't lose this money. And so that's, that partially explains the duality. And when you think about it that way, because I do want to talk about recapitalizations and down rounds, because there's a lot of that happening, and it's complicated and geeky, but we should talk about it. But when you think about that, other than that, you are generally not funding companies that are run by the offspring of the founders, which is something we'll talk about later, maybe. What are some of the other differences between what Afsani is looking for and what you are looking for in these companies?
Yeah. So I had a few reps where I tested this, but the most important thing when investing in a seed stage company is the founding team. You are going to sink or swim with that team. No matter how good the idea is, no matter how massive the market opportunity is, no matter how novel the solution is, if it's not an A team, it is at some point going to fail. So the number one thing that we screen for is that team. And what we're looking for in that team is one, why are you uniquely qualified to build this thing, right? Is there something in your personal life or experience that prepares you for this moment? Is there, do you have a PhD in this subject, like domain expertise? Or it doesn't have to be a PhD, but domain expertise or experience, right? What is it that ties you to this thing that's going to give you an unfair advantage over everyone else? So that's one. Two, on that team, there has to be a salesperson. There has to be, right? Because you're selling on so many different fronts, right? And probably the most important front that you're selling on is other people buying in to the vision and joining the team. Because no great company is ever built by one or two people. It's built by an amazing team. And if you can't recruit people, if you can't recruit top talent, you're going to fail. The other place that you need to sell is obviously your customers, right? But then you got to be able to raise money. You've got to be able to sell to investors, right? Because we'll fund you, and whoever we go into this thing with will fund you as well. But at some point, that money's going to run out, and you've got to be able to convince others that they should also take a bet on you, right? So those are the two primary characteristics that we look for. And then a third is consistent history of overachievement, right? And that could show up in a lot of different ways. It could show up the traditional ways. You went to all the top schools and you excelled there. Or maybe you were a standout athlete, which means that you had to put in a lot of work to get to where you were. Or you could be, the eldest child in a single family home that had to take care of your brothers and sisters, still got yourself through college, and now are in position to create this company. That's a big fucking achievement, right? And so being able to look at these things and recognize like consistent overachievement is important, because starting a company is probably going to be the hardest thing that you've ever done. There are going to be ups, there are going to be a lot of downs. And if you don't have a history of, fighting through those walls, then when, maybe it's the first challenge or the second challenge, you're going to quit. And I'm not in it for you to quit on me.
I don't know how many of you were doing this as Marlon was going, sort of ticking through that list, but I was putting names to the people who I know well, who embody those characteristics or experiences. I'll do a quick digression, and I won't mention her name right now, but one of our partners who has a very senior role here at Lowenstein put 5 of her younger siblings through college, working at a fast food restaurant, college and grad school, and then put herself through, ending up at Yale Law School, and put herself through in her 30s, and has done some other things, including training for a particular sport, which she started competing in at a national level in her 50s. And she is a complete badass success and someone that I work very closely with. And it is kind of, if you didn't know that about her, once you do, you're like, yeah, I see that. That makes, that makes total sense that, that she did that. And I would challenge those of you who just heard Marlon tick through that list, for the people in your life that are embodiments of those characteristics, those experiences, maybe go to them and say, hey, I've been thinking about this thing, and I heard this guy Marlon say this stuff, and I want you to know that this is a reason that I believe in you. This is a reason that I would want to support you, whether financially or otherwise, in some, in some endeavor. And it is something I admire about you, which I will go do after this to the friend and partner that I just described. But I think it's a great set of attributes. I do want to flip to the other side of this, the downside of this. We are seeing a lot of recapitalizations in the marketplace, and we're also seeing a lot of stock option repricing, and we are seeing companies that raised money and they're just not going to, they are going to quit. There's a good argument for why it might be better to quit sooner and return capital. We see that from time to time. We also see people not realize that it's time to quit and return capital and keep going. And we do see people on occasion, pivot and pull out a victory. But can you talk a little bit about the days of reckoning that we're living through in venture, either of you, with the recapitalizations? And you don't have to, name names. Sure, none of it is going on in your portfolio.
Of course not. I mentioned like running through that brick wall, right? But you also have to be have a certain level of humility too, right? So you talk about giving money back early, right? I think the best entrepreneurs are always listening to the market. They're always listening to their customer, and they're reevaluating their solution set. And you might get to a point where you're like, this thing that we're building, no one wants it, right? So the best thing to do is to either figure out what someone wants, or what the new product is, and go from there, or like you said, return capital. We have a company in our portfolio called System 2, and what did they start out at? I can't even remember what they started out as, but it took basically 2 years, cut burn all the way down, took 2 years, and built this new business where it's like an online platform that allows coaches to run their business. And the company is about to be profitable. They're growing top line by about 3x year over year. They're about to raise their seed round now, and I think they're looking at 2 million in revenue already. So just this founder just took the time to like listen to the market, and looked at what they had and figured out how to repurpose that thing to become a business that could actually do well. There's a lot of reduction in pricing going on now. We have some I guess you call them now growth stage companies in the portfolio. valued at over $1 billion. And, the companies themselves are doing really well from a performance perspective, right? But you can't, in this market, our LPs will kind of look at us sideways if we left the mark where it was a year ago.
I just want to interrupt for 1 second. So you're supposed to value at current market, and that's called mark to market for those who don't. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, in venture and how we do it, we typically just mark to the last price round and leave it there, right?
Right, but if the last price round was in, like, I don't know, May of 2022 or September of 2021, the
if it's
world
12 to
has
18 months, then yeah. So anyway, so you have to think about how to bring some of those marks down. And it really sucks when the company is performing like on all cylinders and you still have to do it just because their peers are being marked down by 50%, 60% on the secondaries market. But you gotta figure it out. So we work with financial professionals to help us figure out what's a fair number to reduce these companies by.
And Afsani, your portfolio is very different. Are you experiencing some version of this?
We are. I mean, we do have businesses across the life cycle, so we do have growth stage businesses.
We do have growth stage businesses, and I think going back to the qualities you're looking for different businesses of the life cycle, I think having management teams and founders who can really read the market and who are not anchoring, I could say it's emotionally very difficult to think your business, a year ago was worth 300 million on a totally different business plan that was very easy, and now it's worth 100 million, and you've had to work really hard to kind of stay afloat. And I think it does take a lot of humility, but a lot of confidence in yourself to say, okay, that was then, this is now, I don't know when then is going to come back. I'm going to cut my cash burn and I'm just going to pivot, not losing the ethos of my business, but pivot to something that's more palatable. So we have a business in West Africa. We sold a bricks and mortar pharmacy business to a large health tech. It's a great business. And, they really capitalized on the liquidity and the boom. And a large part of their business was investing in software for pharmacies and inventory management and tech enabling the supply chain. So back to my earlier point that Africans pay more for pharmaceuticals than anywhere else in the world, largely it's because the pharmacy chains themselves aren't able to make decisions about inventory. They're not purchasing enough because they don't have the cash and the liquidity, and they're just making like small purchases. And so this business had invested huge amounts of money in very sophisticated inventory management and supply chain software that was really the first of its kind in Africa. Lots of people were using it, but it had very thin margins and actually had a really terrible cash flow cycle because they were selling to pharmacies, they were selling to governments, they were also selling to pharma companies to help them manage their inventory, and they were just getting really squeezed. Basically, none of their customers were paying them. And when the market turned, whereas before they were growing, 200-300% a year on very thin margins, and nobody was looking at their receivables, and nobody really actually cared if they were generating any cash because it was revenue, and the revenue wasn't being written off, and it was disruptive, and it was tech. That really came crashing down. And so they had thought they were going to raise money at 400 million, and they ended up pricing a convert with a really high liquidation pref at, depending how you do the math, like 170. And they basically mothballed their tech business in a way. They focused on their bricks and mortar pharmacies. They really focused on reducing cash burn. They had to rationalize a lot of people, but they were so determined to survive. And a lot of it, I think, was mission driven because they were also one of the largest retailers of pharmaceuticals on the continent. And so it was either be anchored on my flashy business model and this high valuation, or actually create a systematic risk to the healthcare of many countries. I'm just going to eat the humble pie, take this money which was terribly dilutive to the founder, but just keep going. And I think the investors really respected that. we respected that. We had structured our deal actually that we would convert our safe into the last priced round, so we did fine. But I really admire the founder that he really took it on the chin and he was really professional about it because he had a really strong sense of vision and a strong sense of purpose.
So I'm just going to conclude with a little bit of guidance on some of these financing situations that we're seeing where companies are being recapped. And there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is in a company recapitalization where who's winning and who's losing on the company's cap table or equity holder structure changes. You do still need strong management, and management usually gets some sort of refreshed equity or some sort of reset equity. And there's some sort of incentive to keep them in place because, as Marlon said earlier, you can't have them quit on you. Someone is usually being made unhappy in that transaction, and the person or fund or people or funds being made unhappy sometimes object, sometimes threaten litigation, sometimes actually it gets to litigation, and we do have several of those that are ongoing right now. The focus has to be on clean process. Most of these companies, especially in the US, but also we see a lot of this on the continent, most of these companies are Delaware corporations, and Delaware law is really focused on clean process. And that means that if you are in the boardroom, you must come forward and identify your self-interest. A common misperception is that if I'm not an investor, then I'm not an interested board member for purposes of the deal. Well, if you're the CEO, you serve at the pleasure of the board members who control your equity refresh, your base pay, your bonus. Delaware thinks, and that's what matters here, Delaware thinks you're an interested board member. And you have to make that disclosure, you have to understand that, and then it gets to counting noses. Counting noses to see if there are any people in the room who are, for purposes of that particular deal, actually disinterested board members. Very different than having the title independent director. You can be an independent director and be an interested board member. Are you getting paid to be an independent director? Who appointed you? Are you an LP in one of the funds? There are all sorts of things that could make you interested, even though you are technically, quote, independent or sitting in the independent seat. If you don't have at least two, because one director alone cannot deliberate, and Delaware loves deliberation. If you don't have at least two independent directors, it's going to be hard to convince people that the process was really clean. And this is where Delaware law comes in with this really important bifurcation. I know this is nerdy, I'm sorry. I was very popular in elementary school, by the way. The bifurcation is there's something called the business judgment rule. And the business judgment rule says that a board member can be stupid. A board member can be wrong. Board member can be both of those things, but they do have to be honest and paying attention. And if you're honest and paying attention and the process is clean because you're not on both sides of the transaction, the courts will defer to your business judgment, however wrong and stupid it is. On the other hand, you could be really brilliant, but if you don't have clean process, not because you did anything untoward, but simply because everyone in the room is interested, like everyone in the room is also writing another check, right? Then Delaware says you don't have the business judgment rule. We're not going to defer to your business judgment. You're now in entire fairness. And when you're in entire fairness, you have to prove, so the burden is on the board to prove that the deal was entirely fair. Each component of the deal was entirely fair. And that's a really difficult burden to carry, also known as a case you will settle. In the other direction, the complaining stockholder who feels aggrieved, they have the burden once it's your business judgment that's being deferred to. also known as a case they are likely to be advised to settle. These are really important because you do have to look around your boardroom and you do have to figure out, is someone getting disproportionate pain in this transaction? And if so, how do we revisit that? So it is hard to do that with just VCs and PE people. And we see a lot of companies say, remember those 2 independent seats we said we'd fill later that we never got around to filling? Now that someone has just threatened to sue us, can we get someone to fill those seats? And the answer is no. And the reason is because someone has just threatened to sue you, right? So no one wants that liability. So those are just things that we're seeing a lot of and guiding a lot of people through. And it is, if the only thing you remember from that little monologue, was business judgment rule, just remember to ask, how do we get business judgment rule to apply to the board here? That's a really important takeaway. So on that happy catastrophizing note, I want to thank Marlon and Afsani for being so generous with their time, backgrounds, and insights. I want to thank all of you for showing up and for sticking around for this long a conversation, and thank our colleagues at Lowenstein for putting this together. And you should check out our upcoming events, and particularly the Women in Venture series is pretty awesome. And I have nothing to do with it other than to cheer from the outside of the room. But it's definitely worth checking out. So thank you all so very much, and we'll see you soon.